Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Hammer Museum. I'm Claudia Bester. I'm the Director of Public Programs here at the Hammer, and I'm pleased to welcome you to tonight's discussion about how the world's biggest cities are approaching sustainability in the face of climate change. Throughout 2018, the Hammer Museum and the UCLA Sustainable LA Grand Challenge have been exploring the technology, infrastructure, and ideas that can make Los Angeles the first entirely sustainable megacity in the United States. A grand challenge, and we're up to it. Brewing strong. We call this series Future LA, Engineering a Sustainable Supercity. Each month we're discussing one specific arena, such as building a sustainable energy grid, mobility and the future of transportation, and what the built environment is going to look like as our population grows. Tonight, our panelists will each give presentations. Oops, sorry, I skipped a little piece. Tonight our panelists are going to each give presentations here at the podium, and then they will sit down for discussion with our moderator, Mark Gold, and in the end we'll take audience questions. Tonight we're going to compare several major cities, beginning with three of the world's largest, Mexico City, Tokyo, and Shanghai, which are all megacities with populations of more than 20 million people. And then three more gigantic cities, Paris, London, and Los Angeles, with populations in the 5 to 20 million person range, depending on how you measure it. Each of these cities has a unique set of properties and challenges, and each have in recent years made pledges towards sustainability. So how are they doing it, and how does LA compare? Well, we have three experts with us here tonight who can fill us all in on the game plan. Our first panelist is Dana Cuff. Cuff is a professor of architecture and urban design here at UCLA, where she's also the director of City Lab, a think tank that advances experimental urbanism and architecture. Since receiving her PhD in architecture from Berkeley, she has published and lectured widely about spatial justice and affordable housing. She's the author of several books, including The Provisional City, about housing in Los Angeles, and a forthcoming book documenting the Urban Humanities Initiative, an innovative cross-disciplinary project she started here at UCLA. Over 6 years of studies in urban humanities, Cuff and her students have taken numerous collaborative research projects to Tokyo, Shanghai, Mexico City, and also around here in Los Angeles. And based on research studies and recommendations her team conducted at the UCLA City Lab, she co-authored a landmark new planning and zoning law for California, which permits the construction of backyard homes on virtually all 8 million single-family properties in California, with the potential to double the density of suburbs throughout the state. And you know what? We're going to need it because LA is estimated to grow by 1.5 million people in the next, Mark, 20 years? Fast. We're growing fast. We need more housing, bottom line. So after Professor Cuff, we'll hear from Matt Petersen, the former Chief Sustainability Officer for the City of Los Angeles. In that position, he was the chief architect of the Sustainable City Plan. He helped LA become a global leader in electric vehicles, solar, and water conservation, and he helped create the Climate Mayors, a network of U.S. mayors who are adopting the Paris Climate Agreement in their cities. Now Petersen is the president and CEO of Los Angeles Cleantech Incubator, or LACI. LACI's goal is to create an inclusive green economy by unlocking innovation, transforming markets, and enhancing community. Petersen is a chair of the Climate Mayors Board and a board member of Habitat for Humanity of Greater Los Angeles, the Center for Environmental Health, and the Sir Edmund Hillary Institute for International Leadership. He also created the Citizen E grant program to find and support individuals taking responsibility for a corner of their world. Finally, our moderator this evening will be Mark Gold. Mark formerly served as president of the environmental group Heal the Bay, which is dedicated to making Southern California coastal waters and watersheds safe, healthy, and clean. He's worked extensively over the last 20 years in the field of coastal protection and water pollution. Gold received his bachelor's and master's in biology and his doctorate in environmental science and engineering here at UCLA, and he was recently appointed UCLA's Associate Vice Chancellor for Environment and Sustainability. So now, as I said before, our first speaker will be Professor Dana Cuff, so please join me in giving her a warm welcome.
Wow, that's really bright, right in my eyes. Thank you all for coming. Thanks to the Hammer for hosting us for this interesting evening, and to Mark Gold for bringing me into the conversation with Matt Petersen, which I'm really looking forward to. my work and that of my students, many of whom are here tonight, has been funded by the Mellon Foundation to really try to see the cultural linkages between the 4 cities that we are investigating on the Pacific Rim that Claudia explained: Shanghai, Mexico City, Tokyo, and Los Angeles. And the way we approach that generally has been from a cultural perspective, but because they are megacities, we are always dealing with questions of sustainability, resilience, and environmental ecology issues. So I'd just like to single out a small thread of some of the 6 years of work that we've been doing in these 4 cities. I could talk to you tonight really about what I might think of as the crises, the premier crises that each city faces. Mexico City, with something like 25 million, is so broad and so vast that Los Angeles seems dense by comparison. People's commutes are often 4 to 6 hours a day, and a third of their salary goes to that commute. And so the idea there of trying to condense and densify and make more livable, literally, the geography of the city is a critical issue. In Tokyo, I think we're all pretty aware of the aging population there and the problem that that's causing, along with low fertility rates and so little immigration, that basically that 38 million person city, that's actually still the largest city in the world, is deeply in need of young workers to support its economy and its aging population. And there have been hypotheses that Tokyo will be the tipping point of a megacity collapse because of this aging population. And in Shanghai, the 24 million people there is so disproportionately successful in contrast to its rural areas that the domestic migration has created, and all of that domestic migration being illegal, something like 30% of the population is without documentation. Each of those, if I were just asked to speak about one city, might be the way I would think through their sustainability questions. And you can see from the way I'm framing that it's a cultural problem as well as a geographical problem. And all of those also have environmental and economic impacts. But instead, what I'd like to do is really talk to you about just one small thread we could draw. It's not very small, actually. One thread we could draw through all 4 cities, if we throw Los Angeles in there as well, which has to do with the relationship between urbanism and nature through the lens of water. All right, so let me show you what I mean by that. So, Godzilla knocking down the power lines of Tokyo was prescient. This was a post-atomic bomb movie that was talking about the nuclear threat and its basic impact on the power and infrastructure of the city. And when the 2011 earthquake hit off the Pacific coast of Tohoku with a 9.0 Richter scale measure, the tsunami that was caused on March 11th not only knocked out the Fukushima power plant, but that also knocked out some 150 miles away, Tokyo. And people were stranded in their high-rise buildings without heat, without electricity, trying to figure out how to cook for several days. So the linkages between cities along in the Japanese coastal region, the damage was not limited to that area. It was a 3-part disaster: nuclear, earthquake, and tsunami. And I think when I look at this photo, the sort of pathos that you see in the seawall is so apparent, this semi-heroic but desperate idea that we could actually fend against Mother Nature seems seems quite desperate. And I would say one of the things that we've learned from looking at Tokyo is that then there are these two kinds of responses, one of which is similar to the seawall, the tsunami towers that are built, particularly with this aging population that I was describing. You're supposed to walk to the top of that tower, chain yourself to the top, and then wait in case some ships float by when the tsunami hits. And people do practice getting up to the top of that, but it's pretty heroic to make it to the top under those kind of circumstances. By contrast, since almost 600 years ago, tsunami stones have been placed on the hillsides, marking where prior tsunamis have hit. And the quote that you see here is from one of those stones. "High dwellings are the peace and harmony of our descendants. Remember the calamity of the great tsunamis. Do not build any homes below this point." And in some villages, there's a kind of annual ritual that takes people past these stones so they know exactly how high they would have to go if history has any lesson for the present. That's a hard concept for us here in America, but I think we've learned something. And the reason I call this intimacies, I think, is because one thing that we're trying to look at in our Pacific Rim studies is to cast new geographies, especially cultural and environmental geographies, among cities that are now not just linked around the Pacific Ocean, but through rather underwritten histories of interconnection. One of those that was discovered not so long ago, let me say this first. So in the post-Fukushima era, though architects and like Atelier Bow Wow and the planner Yasuaki Onoda made a lot of plans in concert with the government to move fishing villages higher on the hills, actually in direct relationship to those tsunami stones. Politics and engineering won out again, and merely higher seawalls were built. Not only do we think of this as actually another somewhat desperate attempt, though it will take an even bigger tsunami to breach it, but it's also disconnected the villages from their livelihood. So water may not get over, but people can't get over either. And so the solution is actually now causing all kinds of new problems. So in this notion of intimacies, probably all of you read, as I did in 2015, what had been undergoing scientific investigation for some time. And that was a kind of intimacy between the Pacific Northwest and the Japanese coast in a kind of mysterious red cedar forest that had been submerged and discovered to be submerged. And by looking at tree rings, it was determined that this submergence happened around 1700. It was because the Japanese kept records of tsunamis that we learned from them that there was a giant tsunami, and we could perfectly date the earthquake that happened in the Pacific Northwest, which then led us to understand about the Cascadia subduction zone and our earthquake dangers in the Pacific Northwest that hadn't been documented before, in part because we didn't have such historic records. And that interconnectivity is the kind of intimacy that I think we could only say is even more exaggerated in our relationships to Mexico, since we were Mexico and we were both Spain and we are all one geography. There's a deep intimacy between California and Mexico and the two major cities in that region, Los Angeles and Mexico City. You can see from these maps how our governance and geography has been tied. As you probably also know, Mexico City, formerly known as Tenochtitlan by the Aztecs who founded the city there in the 1300s, was built in a lake, Lake Texcoco, and that was partly for protection and partly for agricultural reasons. The floating islands that you can still see in Xochimilco, also called Chinampas, were really the system by which the Aztec city operated. What this means, of course, today is that 30% of Mexico City remains atop a lake formation. And that has some negative effects, which is that the city, which is something like 573 square miles, sinks as much as 9 inches a year in some places. Yeah, pretty exaggerated. And there have been, of course, engineering solutions there as well. The creation of the Grand Canal is not unlike our Los Angeles River, an attempt to remove the floodwaters that come from all the hills around the city and get them out of the city so that the regular flooding, which actually still happens, doesn't happen so frequently. That Grand Canal was built in the late 1800s and was 29 miles of engineering that moves tens of hundreds of thousands of gallons out of the city to solve both plumbing and sewage problems. Here you see a diagram of the basic dilemma, a kind of dilemma that we face with the San Gabriels and mountains around us as well. Mexico City needs more water. Drinking water is a really fundamental infrastructural problem in the city, and it loses that both by siphoning it out of the city and by the leakages in the pipes. And so there's a massive effort to try to solve this water problem, which was once seen merely as reducing the floods and now is seen as a recovery of a life force. And you can see in the photograph how that subsidence is actually impacting streetscapes, which is pretty visible even on the street. Los Angeles, like Mexico City, was founded around water, not nearly the same volumes of it. If you go back something like 9,000 years to the Tongva settlement along the Ballona wetlands, which you see in the red circle when you look at the watershed map for Los Angeles, or at the Pueblo, where the Spanish missionaries founded the city, also actually on a Tongva settlement, but at the confluence of the Arroyo Seco and LA rivers. We still see water being a critical component. Even though Los Angeles River was really never navigable, it served a critical purpose, especially prior to its channelization, in that its meandering delivered topsoil to the agricultural land all around its movement. After many, many floods, the last one in 1938, the Army Corps of Civil Engineers, as we know, channelized all 51 miles and turned nature into something highly urban, and also removed all this water from our groundwater systems, which we now know that we need to recover. I'd like to show you now just a couple of ways that urbanists and architects have been thinking about some of these environmental issues, also from a cultural point of view, and raise some questions about how nature in the city today might be imagined. And so when I look at the LA River ecosystem restoration, this project from 2016, I see nostalgia for something that is not urban at all. The hints of urbanism from the jogging path with only 3 people there, and a distant overpass that also seems really overgrown, no cars, but maybe more trees, is a way in which there's a kind of desire to reconnect with nature, but to do so in a way that really pushes the city out of the picture, literally. If we look at the way, say, Shanghai dealt with its river problems, this is the last tributary of the Yangtze River, the Huangpo, which is what organized Shanghai's most recent history, where in the 1840s it became a treaty port city. It's a relatively young city by Chinese standards, though it began as a Chinese city in the 1200s. It really became a bona fide booming city in the 19th century. And you can see that the British and French and American colonial project there, which was to have a free treaty port in China, built the wall that formed the edge of the river, and the boats pulled right up to that passageway. Again, hurricanes and flooding meant that the Bund, the walkway along the river, would get elevated, as you can see in the image on the right. And that was intended, like a seawall, not to permit the water to flood the city. Along with that seawall, though, which is actually made as a connective strip, unlike the seawall that we saw in Tokyo, it's tied to something like 50 kilometers of paths of permeable surface, but also along those paths are museums, historical markers, places for pedestrians and cyclists, and anyone who's been to Shanghai has seen the regular performance that's really astounding all along the Bund of Tai Chi and fan dancing and kite flying and granny dancing. All these incredible organized groups that use the Bund as a cultural site. And you might say that the work that Lauren Bond and our own Alison Carruth from UCLA are working on similar ideas for the LA River, not keeping it purely as a flyway or a ecological restoration project, but actually trying to find ways to deal with both environmental and cultural issues together. Lauren Bond's is a giant water wheel, of which, in fact, there was a water wheel some in the 19th century. But it's a means to take water out of the river along with a dam that she's gotten permissions for and put that water back into the groundwater of the neighborhoods nearby and create neighborhood water events and educational opportunities. Alison Carruth's project, Play the LA River, is one that you can see. It was 2015 exciting way to bring all the people of the city into kind of artistic and educational means to think through how we would imagine the city in the future. The last generation of architects really also thought about this. The metabolists in Japan, led by Kenzo Tange's most famous plan for Tokyo Bay in the post-war era, was a way of thinking about actually merging the city and the water with a massive megastructural scheme. Similarly, or maybe in a slightly different vein, the group Accept Integrated Sustainability, a design firm, has developed a Shanghai master plan that really reestablishes the canals that went through that city as a form of urban infrastructure. So, through our multidisciplinary connections across the Pacific, we, within the Urban Humanities Initiative, have come to recognize the social, historical, and ecological intimacies that exist between us now and how those might speculate and generate future intimacies. This view of urban nature through the medium of water is just one demonstration of our collective drive for a more sustainable urban life. Thank you.
All right, good evening. It is a little bright. All right, so some lovely people out there in the audience with us tonight. Thanks for being here. Thanks to the Hammer. All right, I think for most of you, anybody want to guess what city this is? Tough guess, tough, I know. All right, so I had the good fortune of being able to visit many amazing cities when I worked for the mayor of Los Angeles and representing him in an organization known as C40. And C40 is a global organization of megacities coming together to fight climate change. And we know climate is our most pressing crisis facing humanity. Some, of course, you know, from a risk standpoint, nuclear war probably has got a higher risk, but probability-wise, climate change far outweighs that real impact that we see from climate change here and now. We're facing here in Los Angeles, and other cities are facing around the world. And while I was with Mayor Garcetti, we also created this Climate Mayors that was talked about earlier, where we said, under Obama, how do we put wind at the back of the White House to go to Paris to negotiate the Paris Climate Agreement and get a robust commitment? And that evidence of the cities coming together helped give the Chinese the confidence that Obama was serious. President Obama was serious about his commitment. And we had a big conference here in Los Angeles of U.S. and Chinese cities that gave them that confidence. Now it's all changed, obviously. He who shall not be named did a different tack, and we said, all right, we're changing course as well. We are going to adopt the Paris Climate Agreement in our cities. And we went from June 1st, I was on my way to Beijing that morning to represent the mayor at the Clean Energy Ministerial meeting there. And we announced during the occupant of the White House's speech that he was withdrawing from the Paris Climate Agreement, that we had 70 mayors committed to adopting the Paris Climate Agreement. The next day, within 24 hours, we had 170. And in a few months, we had 400 mayors who had all committed to adopting the Paris Climate Agreement in their cities. Yeah, they deserve a round of applause. A lot of work to be done. But one of the core challenges that every city faces, besides energy, besides industrial pollution, from an air quality as well as certainly greenhouse gas emission standpoint, is transportation. And so, you know, London is now already in the City of London, which is, you know, the Greater London Authority is made up of a bunch of boroughs or small cities that each have some governance on their own. But the mayor of London's strongest power and lever of power is the transport. And so in the City of London now, that core center of the city, that's the financial center, diesel trucks and diesel vehicles are banned. By 2020, there's going to be an ultra-low emission zone, and if actually I think it's even be sooner, you're going to have to pay $130 pounds to enter into that part of the city if you have a polluting vehicle that's not considered an ultra-low emissions vehicle. So we see London really leading the way. They've got a congestion mitigation fee, the only city in the world really adopting it at scale, and that's part of how they've ratcheted up over time. If you've driven a rental car in London and you forgot to pay your fee, you've gotten that notice in the mail. I did, and I had to pay it later on. But it's pretty impressive how it's worked. I mean, certainly there are people that have complained, and there's some concerns about it being regressive, but there's really been incredible progress there. And as the cities move to lower emission buses and now electric buses, they've really helped lead the way. But another amazing city that doesn't need to be told what city it is Paris. And today, actually, Mayor Hidalgo announced that every one Sunday a month, and Mayor Hidalgo is right now the chair of C40. Mayor Sadiq Khan of London is also active in C40, as is Mayor Garcetti. She announced that every once a month in Paris, on a Sunday, one Sunday a month, no vehicles will be allowed in the center of Paris. Pretty phenomenal commitment, and she's taken a lot of other bold actions. I mean, the air quality in Paris is at crisis levels, as we're seeing here in Los Angeles, as we've had record numbers of bad air days, non-attainment air days in Los Angeles. And so Mayor Hidalgo has really taken some bold leadership, as has Mayor Khan, and there's going to be an all-diesel ban by 2020. And this efforts altogether obviously lead to really cleaning up the air and leading by example. And what's that do for the industry? We know California is leading in so many ways, as the recent Global Climate Action Summit in San Francisco showed, really leading the way on climate change in the U.S. and really around the world. And that demand that's being put upon automakers and truck manufacturers is beginning to change the marketplace. We haven't reached critical mass yet, but we know in Europe, as diesel becomes less prominent, Dieselgate and European manufacturers' scandals with diesel cars and trucks is really beginning to change the game, and now we're headed towards zero emissions transportation. But another city that's worth talking about is Shenzhen. So a city that in 1976, I think, was 30,000 people. 40 years later, it's 10 million. It's one of the fastest growing cities, and it's become the center of electric vehicles. That whole region, Hong Kong, Guangzhou, and Shenzhen, I've also been to Shenzhen and representing the mayor, is I think is on the track to be 120 million people and and above. It's pretty mind blowing. But Shenzhen has 16,000 electric buses. Anybody know how many buses there are in LA County with the metro system? A wild guess? 2,000, 5,000, in between, 3,000. And so we're headed to all electric buses in the county of Los Angeles in the metro system, and LA DOT and other systems are soon following suit. And that's 3,000 buses. They've already converted to 16,000 electric buses. And I've seen the massive infrastructure they've deployed to do that, to charge those vehicles. And now they're moving to an all-electric taxi fleet. And they're also taking 20,000 light-duty pickup trucks and SUVs that serve our commercial vehicles off the road by the end of the year, and those are all going to be electric. I mean, this is a scale that you just can't even get. It's mind-boggling. And what's happening in China. And Shenzhen is really leading the revolution. And a company called Build Your Dreams, and BYD, is headquartered in Shenzhen. And they've now eclipsed Tesla as the largest seller of electric vehicles in China. All right, so we've talked about LA a little bit tonight, but something I just want to hit on for a second is our leadership. So the mayor committed to an ultra-low emission zone, which we anticipate will be an actual zero-emission zone. We don't know where that will be in the city yet. Some have talked about parts of downtown or perhaps the Arts District, or my organization I run now. Lacey is headquartered. And that's going to be an exciting and challenging time. We've seen what a year ago, nobody thought people would be zipping around on electric scooters. Now that's really a predominant transportation mode, and not just for fun, but actually reducing those those trips of 2 miles or less, which is really where we get a lot of traffic in our cities, and that's really good news. And it's eroding Uber and Lyft's market share in those vehicles, and now they're getting in the business of electric scooters for those shorter trips. But LA is really leading by example. So the mayor, the county, the Metropolitan Transit Authority, the utilities, DWP in Southern California, Edison, and a number of corporate partners came together with my organization to release this 2028 Zero Emissions Roadmap. How do we get there further, faster together in an unprecedented collaboration to move to electric vehicles by the time the world arrives here in Los Angeles for the Olympics in 2028? And so we've set a goal of getting to an additional 25% decrease in greenhouse gas emissions by that date. It's going to take a lot of work, and groups like Mark and the team at UCLA across the entire university are going to be critical to our success and being able to achieve that goal. So with that, I want to thank you and look forward to our panel discussion.
Out of your mic so that I could make my points better.
I like it.
So we saw a pretty large variety of different types of megacities, and really the challenges that we have in trying to move those cities towards sustainability. One of the things that just sort of a basic question to just sort of get us going is that you both gave some highlights on various different issues that are different within each of these cities. If there are things that you would like to see us import in either the mindset from the standpoint of how they're dealing with various different sustainability issues. You know, the example with London, how they're dealing with traffic. Or one thing that why I'm really excited, Dana, why you're here tonight, is that having worked on sustainable city plans for the last 25 years myself, really they haven't adequately taken into account cultural differences, and so shedding some sort of light on what we can learn from those other cities that you're looking at, so that really culture can shape sustainability decision making, so it's not all just metrics, would be a really good thing. And so just throw it open to both of you guys and sort of what you think we could really learn from in LA and sort of changing how we move forward in Los Angeles, where we have the Sustainable City Plan, and LA County is putting together their first ever Sustainable City Plan, and UCLA is working with them and putting that together.
Well, so there's actually a lot to learn when you visit other cities and see how they're approaching their policy changes. Can you hear me? Is this mic working?
Yeah.
Okay, great. One that I didn't talk about is one that I learned from my equivalent group in Mexico, Laboratorio de la Ciudad, which is exactly the translation of City Lab. But they run something called legible policy. And in a way, it's this practice by which all the new policies are tested, not unlike the kind of New York closing of the streets in a temporary way before they hardened those street closures. But it's a way of testing whether the changes actually improve the quality of life for the people who live there. And they do it neighborhood by neighborhood. So we worked on one that was called Pietoninos, which was the reduction of traffic deaths around Mexico City. And we worked with Mexican students and faculty and policymakers there to shut down streets and test out what it would mean to make a city street for play space, which in my mind goes into the sustainability ranks, because it's putting people over cars, and that's part of what, if we don't actually make the city better when we take the cars out, it's hard to convince people that lower greenhouse gases is a good enough reason, because we don't quite get that in a day-to-day experience. But people really get when their children can go out and play soccer on the street. And by making that policy legible, meaning that it was marked, it was implemented in different cities, it became actually a multi-city planning policy in Mexico. I want to do that here. Why don't we have something like that and have a kind of legible policy strategy? So that's just one example.
Yeah, it's a good one.
That's great. One of the things we put on the Sustainable City Plan when I was in the mayor's office was this notion of culture and connection to neighborhoods. I mean, Ciclavia, of course, with the 100th anniversary of the Philharmonic this past weekend, Ciclavia was a centerpiece of that celebration. But that idea of reclaiming our streets and reorienting ourselves to reclaim our streets and our relationship with them is really powerful. And so one of the things we put in the Sustainable City Plan was, how do we make it easier for neighborhoods to get a block party permit and actually close down the street? It was like they had to go to 3 or 4 agencies to get a block party permit to close down a block of a street in a residential neighborhood. So it's one thing, small thing that we did. We made sort of a one-stop shop to go in the city to be able to do that. Reaching back into some previous experience in an organization I used to run called Global Green, we to use the power of culture, and to popularize fuel-efficient vehicles back. This was in the run-up to the Iraq War. We said, how do we get people to realize that fuel-efficient cars are fun and sexy to drive? So we enlisted celebrities to go to the Oscars. The only car company that would loan us a hybrid car was Toyota. It was actually a dealership, a Toyota of Hollywood, that really gave us the cars. And it was a meme in the media. Younger folks won't remember it, but it was something that got people to go, well, if Cameron Diaz can go to the Oscars in a ball gown in a tiny first-generation Prius, I guess I could drive one. And no. So we'd hear these anecdotes from across the country, like Republican moms of parents of people I knew, like, hey, I really didn't think about that before, but now I might drive one, and I could save money. And so there are things we can do, but there's an equity question too. So if you live on the west side like I do, you see a lot of people driving Teslas, not really an economically attainable vehicle. So how do we help electric vehicles speak Spanish, and how do we help them actually be more affordable? So there's a lot of efforts underway, thanks to people like Kevin De Leon and LA Department of Water and Power, trying to get the right incentives in place to use EVs more affordable for low-income families so that they can get behind the wheel of an electric car.
So, one of the things, Matt, you brought up Shenzhen, and I've been there a couple times myself, and I almost feel like your description of it was completely different than how it was the first 2 times I was there, and I was there only 5 years ago. It wasn't that long, but clearly a lot of things have changed. You see that sort of mad dash towards electrification in an extraordinary way. And it's a city that didn't really have a culture, right? Because as you pointed out, it was 50,000 people. I think it was actually 1985, believe it or not. And now I think Greater Shenzhen, 16 million people, if I recall correctly. Now, so in that sort of situation, there's not as much of the culture to preserve, and so in essence, you're creating a sustainable megacity almost from scratch. Which is quite different. Now, you all have sort of experienced these other cities which are not like that, where they have been there for a long time historically, and they're trying to wrestle with these sorts of issues. How do you sort of contrast the two, in sort of seeing, Shenzhen can do that because they're sort of starting from scratch, whereas obviously you have a history in Paris, history in London, history in Shanghai, Mexico City, et cetera, and even here in LA, it's a long history compared to Shenzhen. So how do you sort of see how you keep culture in place yet still meet the targets in the time frame that we need to, from the standpoint of really making a dent in climate change and not going 2 degrees C or above?
I might put that a little differently, which is, of course, Shenzhen has culture because it may not have history in its exact place built over, a millennium, but all the people who live there have a culture that they bring with them. They formulate a new culture, and maybe what we'd say is there's not a ready sense of something like civil society in the Shenzhen version of that, which is, of course, the Chinese version of civil society is very different than our own. But I remember somebody saying to me when we were doing a design competition out in Paris, California, oh yeah, well, there's no culture out there. And, like all the people in Paris, however many of them there are, will argue about that, as they should. So I think the question would be, like, does a new city, a city that's, bursting, and we probably over-exaggerate the rapid urbanization quality of China. There's so many other factors about Chinese cities, and that's been the heavy blanket that basically describes everything for us here. Like, if it goes fast, it must be Chinese. And that, to me, that's also a way of kind of overlooking the specific differences that happen in all these cities. So how is it that, does it permit new kinds of changes to be implemented more quickly? Do they run into more complications because there isn't some kind of tradition or history that checks and balances the way projects roll out? That would seem, I think, like an interesting question to ask about that region.
Well, I would just reflect. Those are very good points, and to that end, our cities in the West have how long have the cars been around, and how quickly has our relationship to streets and our neighborhoods changed in relative context, and now we're seeing major metropolitan cities, really iconic cities, move to ban cars. And to restrict vehicles within the city center for air pollution, for quality of life, for all those things. And you add in something like an electric bus. How many people have ridden an electric bus in here? More than I would expect. I guess because UCLA's got electric buses.
Yeah, I was going to say we have them on campus.
So, what's the thing you notice that's different about an electric bus? Quiet, right? It's quieter for the people in the bus. It's quieter for the neighborhood. And what a difference that makes to your relationship to the street. And to ride a bus, I mean, it changes the ridership experience. And the electric buses I've been in, there's also more daylight because they, compared to those natural gas loudest buses in the world that Metro runs, they also have that no back window, and they're really dark and not pleasant to be in. Metro's working hard to change that.
So getting back, Dana, to this issue of, typical sustainable city plan, you have your climate targets, you have your electrification targets, you have your water consumption reduction targets. We're getting better and better in putting equity targets in place, green economy targets that I think are really important. But from the standpoint of doing this in a manner that preserves existing culture has been something that I think has been a struggle because it's not as quantitative, and really the change in making cities sustainable because of the pressure of climate change in particular is very, very tied to these quantitative metrics. And it's been very, very effective, to be quite candid, but I'm sure none of us want to do that in a manner at the expense of losing what's so important culturally and what makes it special within these individual cities. And so how do you, as an architect and a planner, ensure that is really embraced in a way that isn't going to slow down the process of having to become more sustainable?
That's a big question.
Yep.
I wish I had a single answer to that. But, when Matt describes global warming as more likely than a nuclear bomb, it's hard to argue against the metrics, right? I mean,
Right.
If we talk about quality of life, if we're not around to appreciate it, of course the metrics have a kind of power in argumentation that is undeniable. But I think the question I always ask is, as we go through that, if we're thinking about daily life in the city, and I think that's what I mean as much by culture as everything else, that basically we're talking about preserving and enhancing, not just preserving, but actually enhancing the quality of life, and for the diverse array of people that we need in the city, that we want in the city. How do we think through that qualitatively as well as quantitatively? So, for an example, let's talk about densification, right? Mm-hmm. So some people would say New York is the greenest city in the United States because it's the most condensed, and it has better transit, and the way we move through it, all of that makes for a more sustainable city. When we talk about density here in Los Angeles, the kind of watchword is don't Manhattanize LA. And I think there's some truth to that, even though I'm a density advocate. How we densify is really the question. So can we actually improve the quality of our lives while we make our city denser? And I think that architects and urbanists and planners, and in combination with humanists, actually have good answers for that. And it's not just about the kind of zoning that says, high along the corridors, low in the suburbs. That we could be more refined and more careful about how we think about that in the various geographies and populations across the city, so that we make the city more affordable, that we think about all the populations who tend to get squashed by these kind of massive solutions that seem like broad brushes, but are actually more like steamrollers.
Now, none of the cities that we've been talking about from the standpoint of sustainability are sort of known for the type of biodiversity that we have here in Los Angeles. And so we've talked about that a lot here at the Hammer in the last year, in that we're blessed as a region in having so much from the standpoint of microclimatic diversity, everything from the Bay all the way up to 10,000 feet high, at Mount Wilson, and everything in between with alpine and coastal wetlands and riparian corridors, et cetera, and as such, high desert, et cetera, we have this incredible biodiversity. You look at all of the cities that we've been talking about, Shanghai wasn't an area that had tremendous wetland biodiversity. The iconic Chinese crocodile used to be hugely prevalent within that area. Now it's pretty extirpated. You can pretty much only find them in zoos. Shenzhen doesn't have that history. London, Paris, being as old as they are as the cities, the biodiversity there is not exactly extraordinary. It gives us a whole bunch of different challenges, I think, that and makes you realize that your sustainability solutions for a city like LA have to be a lot different. And how do you go about taking that into account and really, putting out a comparison of what might work in some of the other cities that you guys have spent a lot of time in, and why they might not work here, even though they might work there? Are there things that sort of pop out to you?
Well, something that you and I've talked a good bit about over the last few years. So let's a couple pieces here. So I think, how do we connect wildlife across? When we've seen this sort of building tunnels or bridges or whatever they might be for wildlife to cross roads or freeways and infrastructure. And here we sort of have the same challenge. How do we, widen the mountain line, the ability for them to procreate with others that aren't related is part of the challenge. And getting them to give the space as well as the ability to migrate without threat of being killed as they cross a freeway or just unwillingness to for good reason. How do we deal with that? And so that's one piece, is how do we connect the dots of nature here in Los Angeles? Yes, we have more biodiversity, but it is at risk for that reason. The other is, if I live in Watts, I am blessed to live in Santa Monica, but I pay a lot of money to do that, and that's one of the things that's a threat to our culture is just housing prices. If I live in Watts and I don't necessarily have access to the Santa Monica Mountains, how do I, I'm not experiencing that biodiversity. So if I live in the hills, I'm more threatened by fire and flooding, but I experience a little more of that biodiversity. But how do we help get people to have access to and to get up to Griffith Park or hike to Mescal or whatever the heck it is? And so that's something we also struggled with when I was in the mayor's office.
Or making their stretch of the LA River extraordinary as well.
Absolutely.
That's another big part.
Right.
With that, I'd be glad to open it up to questions from the audience if anybody wants to sort of start us off. I can't see, so I'm going to have to rely on the people with mics. You got to wait for a mic. Sorry about that. The rules of the road.
Is there a mic for our question in the front?
Okay.
Here, you can borrow mine.
No, don't do that.
I just had a real quick question about Shenzhen. Where does the electricity come from to do all that?
Well, most of its electricity still is coming from coal, but they've made massive investments, particularly in that part of China, into renewable energy around, and these huge transmission lines are taking and moving wind and solar across great distances, but it's primarily coal and a lot of hydro.
Yep. Any next questions? There we go.
Hi, I was curious what tax or financial instrument you thought would be the most productive in the next 20, 30 years for producing a greener city, whether it be incentivizing HVDC or taller buildings or something like that, or autonomous vehicles.
That seems like
He's like, I don't work in the mayor's office anymore.
Mark, feel free to chime in. The challenge with the city, like a local government, is the tax policy levers are pretty limited. So then you're left to, what can you do to accelerate, say, a LEED certified building or water? Now we're getting to net zero water and net zero energy buildings. How do we make the permitting process easier and incentivize and come up with a set of performance-based measures along with prescriptive options to get there further, faster? So that becomes, and so, in LA, we've put a lot of requirements on new construction that increases the cost, increases the sustainability, increases our ability to build affordable housing. But it is a challenge as well. So that's why we end up with so many luxury condo buildings, which is unfortunate that's happening. That's also the choice of the market. But I think we need to put the right incentives, the right emphasis, and the right syllable to be able to continue to encourage the right things to be built.
And I think we've seen, obviously, it's been less in the way of economic incentives, but legislative mandates that have occurred that have been quite dramatic in the last couple of years on new building efficiency and getting energy efficiency even in existing buildings. And that's really where California has been leading the way in a major way. And then a lot of the cap and trade funds are being directed to disadvantaged communities to retrofit those buildings much more rapidly. So they're not direct economic incentives, but at least those are two efforts that are really starting to make a big difference in the state of California.
We've so lost our ability to use economics as an incentive because we've so lost our public sector that really what we have at our hands, I think, is rightly said, that it's policy changes. And then it's a kind of advocacy. I really think Ciclavia, for example, is far more systemic than just a nice day out on the road. Why don't we change roadways into bike paths and take the cars off them? Not just once a month, although I think it's amazing that Paris is doing that, but really to change our priorities literally in the way we live our daily lives in the city, and then find ways that actually is changing the quality of life really positively. Starting small and getting bigger, those are the kind of things we could do.
So the example in the cities that you guys have looked at, and I sort of think of Beijing as, for a long time they sort of started out that way and then went the exact opposite direction, trying to mimic us, unfortunately. So not an example of a sustainable Chinese city for sure is Beijing, in light of how they deal with water and traffic and air. But have you seen? I loved your example you gave of Mexico City. Where trying out a new policy and seeing how well it works. Have you seen that sort of thing occur and take hold? Like I know, friends in London on the congestion charge. I mean, they hate it to this day, right? And so, I mean, how has that sort of changed over time? Has that been successful in your eyes, Matt? Has it been working as a whole? Can we do that here without leading to a riot?
Data proves out it's successful in terms of the air quality monitoring. We know the market's changing in terms of vehicles people are purchasing, and that's what's changing. The permits provided to people in China and Beijing in particular is what's changing from internal combustion engines to what they call new energy vehicles or EVs. So I think it's working, and I think, in Paris, Mayor Hidalgo is loathed by people for the changes he's making for the roads along the Seine, but look at the quality. It's creating quality of life changes. And look, we were pushing for congestion mitigation pricing here and there, internally, even conversations, but it's seen as a political third rail in LA. Like, how could you take anybody's ability to drive away? But I think someday that may change.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing you're seeing is that even though these cities are part of C40 and have adopted Paris and to meet those goals, that a lot of the rhetoric, for example, that was being talked about at the climate summit a couple of weeks ago, I felt like I was back in the 70s. It seemed like the air quality driver was actually bigger than climate, and because it obviously has an impact on all of us in our public health and our quality of life in a different, more tangible way than obviously reduction in CO2 emissions. And is that something that you see pretty much predominant throughout C40, or is it just so happens that these are some of the major cities that we're talking about where one of the biggest drivers really is public health?
Well, I just think it's because we've seen such an uptick in air quality problems as well. So here in LA, we're going backwards again. I mean, we're still tremendously better than we were 30, 40 years ago. But same in Paris and London and all these major city centers. So air quality and health is a huge driver, although climate's always behind it.
Right?
When they go down the C40 path, I just let them talk.
Any other questions from the audience? Gotta wait. Keepers of the mic.
Hi. I was wondering if you guys had any kind of experience with, like, in Shenzhen or like those really fast-growing cities, how you mentioned there was only like 50,000 people, and wondering how gentrification like affects those rural families living there, and if the cities took any steps to help those families, I don't know, like to accommodate those families, and maybe relating that how we can help in LA, like especially along the LA River, how we're developing that area, and how we already see in Atwater Village a lot of families are getting displaced. Any of techniques that we could bring here?
Really, I think gentrification is, paired with affordable housing is our sustainability crisis. That's the one that I'm working on most, in a way. One of the complications I think that you're seeing in this is that everything is tied to everything. That's the ecological model. And it makes it very difficult to parse one project out or one problem out. So it takes a lot of us working together to think about that. In China, the questions of gentrification are even more fraught in some ways because political action is so much more complicated and restricted. And so that's one of the things that we're looking at. I see some of the students in our group this year when we go to Shanghai is to see how displacement is happening, and the Chinese students are going to come here and work with us on our own gentrification issues. Gentrification, in a way, the problem of gentrification is primarily displacement. Not that neighborhoods are getting better, but that as they get better, they're removing the people who don't get to receive the benefit of that improvement. So figuring out how to keep people in place, and I think there are many strategies for that. I mean, really one of the purposes of the secondary unit bill was so that people who had a home could keep their homes by generating income in their backyards. I mean, there are many micro solutions like that that I think are more likely to help us than trying to imagine that we would have some authority from a top-down method step in. Something like new tax policies, new kinds of real estate development, profit taxations. Those are the kinds of things that we probably need to be thinking about now. Rent control has done a lot, actually, to keep neighborhoods stable, but it's always under threat and has, many detractors.
Yeah, definitely a complicated issue. Next question.
Thank you. Hi. So this question, I think, ties in well to Dana, what you were just talking about. A cultural aspect of Los Angeles seems to be a reticence or even outrage in response to change. And so, like a road diet in Mar Vista will be met with outrage by locals who are losing, 2 minutes on their commute. Or a parking lot that's destined to become high-density housing. Locals in that area will be furious with that change. So how do we deal with that kind of deeply ingrained reticence to change and to adopt these fixes for high commute times, for a lack of affordable housing? It's
far from perfect, but I just gotta say, having been in City Hall and worked there, what the mayor and the council members in particular, because they're in the front lines, are having to do to get transitional housing built in each council district is maybe not heroic, but damn close. What David Rue's putting up with Mike Bonnet's putting up with, what Wesson had to do to try to get something built in their neighborhood, and taking responsibility for the challenge in their own district, and not punting as they often have in the past by this fiat in land use by fiat of the council member in LA. Now they've all said we've got to do something, and it may not always be the right choice, but they're at least making a choice and laying down and saying we've got to do something.
You know, the YIMBY movement is actually pretty effective now. The UCLA students finally organized their own neighborhood council so that the Holmby Hills Council wasn't only dominated. Yeah, I think it's a really important. It doesn't mean that other people in the vicinity shouldn't have a voice, but the constituency for appropriate change in the city, and I'm using that term pretty broadly, but meaning that there is still some ideas of spatial justice that come along with transformation. It's not going to stay the way it is, because that's basically pulling the ladder up after some of us have already gotten here, which means it excludes people, not allows for evolution. I think the YIMBY movement is our best activist gesture, and that we should join together to have constituencies that support appropriate change. When we did the ADU bill, we had to go to the state to make it happen. We couldn't get it to happen. 10 years we worked locally, and it wasn't democratic representation. It was that there were always some very forceful few voices who were against the, road diet, right? Where 80% of the people in the neighborhood would have supported it, but didn't really get out. One or two people who were really vociferous and seemed dedicated to like a life project to stand against things actually get the ear and then get the urban situation they want when it isn't representing what the rest of us want. So I think we have to take action together.
And just out of curiosity, in any of the megacities that you guys have looked at, do you feel, because these are universal problems, do you feel like any of those cities are sort of a shining example where we can learn from on how to deal with affordable housing in an equitable way? Does any of those cities stand out in that way?
I don't know about you, but I can't say on affordable housing that anything immediately pops to mind. I mean, I think there's sort of this autotopian future that people think that autonomous vehicles are going to solve all our housing problems, and I'm not betting the future on that. And even if they're electric, so I don't. It's such a tough one. But the ADU, the granny flats, how do we get tiny houses to be able to be built in this city? We're trying to work on a project with Perkins and Will and the LA Police Department, and Habitat for Humanity, and one of our startups to see how could we build some tiny houses, single family, single detached units on one property to sort of push through the concerns at the neighborhood level and at the planning department. And we need innovation, and it's not easy. I mean, we understand the concerns are real, but we also need this YIMBY movement to stand up for this, to make it and to test some things,
Let me give one example from Tokyo, which is that property subdivision has no minimum size. So, for instance, if you can sell it, you can build it. So there are lots that are tiny, maybe 10 foot by 10 foot, and then they get this incredibly beautiful architecture that's a tower of rooms. And there's a reason for that that's built into the tax law and, complicated financial and lending kinds of arrangements. But it's curious, they have very careful fire laws because they have a long history of the city burning again and again. So it's not unsafe to have these tiny lots. And I don't see why we wouldn't, if land costs are a big chunk of our housing costs, that might be one solution to also look at.
Yeah, that's a very interesting way of thinking of it. All right, next question from the audience. I have to admit, I was a little flustered thinking so many people are in this fix because they're in multifamily. They're not in the single family space, and most of the solutions we're bringing up are less conducive to dealing with that issue. Yes.
we talked about like you talked about biodiversity and water, and as well as transportation. I think something that I was wondering personally was another big issue that affects health and just wellness in the city of Los Angeles is urban waste and waste infrastructure. So I was wondering like how that fits into the sustainability city plan that we have going on, and how when you've traveled to these megacities, what are some examples of solid waste infrastructure that you've seen that has improved quality of life? Because I know for a fact, like Germany, their landfills, they've reduced so much of that, and they use so much of the trash for energy. And like, how can we implement that here? Do you know?
Well, it's something we certainly put as a priority in the Sustainable City Plan, and the recent commercial franchise agreement that had a lot of hiccups up front when it first got implemented is now being ironed out, and that really increased the recycling rates and availability of infrastructure and commercial and multifamily buildings. One of the big remaining questions is how to deal with food waste and organics, and that's a challenge because if you compost on site or nearby, you're creating methane, but you're also then can use that as a local additive to your soil for gardening and urban farming. If you send it into the sewage system, because we're blessed with the two, as Mark knows well, a sewage and a stormwater system, we send it to Hyperion. That's a great solution because it's a great conveyance mechanism, but the value of that organic waste is diminished once it gets through Hyperion. But it's a trade-off. But and the other challenge now is China's no longer taking our commodities. So what do we do with these? So we have high diversion rates, but now there's nowhere for those commodities to go. So we set a goal in our plan before the China issue came up: is how do we get 50% of all of our diverted waste to be reused in the local economy? How do we get there? Sometimes you got to set a goal and see how people respond.
Did you have any thoughts on that, Dana? Tokyo in particular? Or?
Well, there's a lot less waste generated in some cities, Tokyo being one of those, and that helps a lot if you don't use as much single-use plastics and papers. You're certainly better off not getting it into the waste stream. I'd say Mexico is a perfect cautionary tale. The whole high-rise development up on Santa Fe, which is a fairly new global cities kind of connection, was built in part on a trash dump that has started to calve off, kind of like an avalanche, so that now whole high-rises are closed down because they're precariously sitting where the bluffs have turned back into waste. So, the mismanagement of waste is really writ large in some of the cities that you can look at around the world.
And I would just add, that was really a great question. It's interesting because California used to be a global leader on innovation in solid waste management, and we've lost that edge. We have for a lot of different reasons. There really hasn't been the same investment in new technologies in the state of California that there was back in the 90s on solid waste. And then now obviously with the China shutting the door, we're sort of left with, well, what sort of recycling program do you even have, for example, for all plastics? And so you're seeing some cities like Santa Monica are basically saying, okay, we don't want any plastic packaging anymore. And they haven't quite gone that far, but they went pretty darn close about a month ago. Because they're basically saying there's no market anymore for recycled plastic within the area. And we start thinking about agricultural waste on top of what Matt correctly brought up. And we have not built that infrastructure, and look for a raft of legislation that'll have a climate bent on that to deal with the organic waste side of that equation within the next couple of years. That's going to be the next couple of things that I think you're going to see legislatively.
But just you pointed out the right example. Germany, well, it's not perfect, did a great job on the upstream side, and now we're dealing with in the back end, the downstream side and so hopefully necessity is the mother of invention. Because we didn't get producers to reduce packaging and make things more recyclable, we're dealing with the other end.
All right, another question from the audience?
Hi. We talked a lot, and obviously, when you travel to other places, you're going there to get new ideas from them. You're not going to just always spread your own ideas. But I was wondering if you've
I
traveled.
thought it was to eat good food.
Well, that's a side perk, I guess. But I was wondering if you've ever traveled somewhere and realized that they're using planning ideas or techniques that we use here, or if there's been like an eye-opening experience where you've been able to help another country with methods that we use here, because we've talked a lot about the other end of things.
Sometimes when I go places and I see new versions of suburban sprawl, I feel like we, the mother of suburbs, has really procreated in a bad way. So I have seen those kind of connections. But you know, when we do our work abroad, we're super careful that we are always working with people from that region. And over the time, in the 6 years that we've had this Melon project to work around the Pacific Rim, we've realized we actually can't work without deep collaboration from colleagues in planning, in architecture, and in the humanities, and the students in these other places. So we're actually super careful not to kind of bring new colonial projects, which generally have a bad history, to where we're going. But when we work with colleagues in these other places, I think, you know, it's curious how the Olympics is kind of a unifying component of urban change in megacities. And so our colleagues in Japan were very interested in not only how the 1984 Olympics worked here and how we dealt with traffic and a lack of new venues and things like that, but how communities resisted certain kinds of changes in the Olympics and got some representation. And we actually now are learning back. So people in Tokyo are being basically introduced to the ideas of Airbnb and you know, different kinds of sharing that isn't part of the normal way that people entertain or, you know, would have house guests. So there are ways in which this kind of doubling of the density they're expecting in Tokyo in 2020, which is kind of hard to imagine. It would mean like 60 million people will be in the city. So I don't even know what that means, but it's really interesting. They were talking to us quite a bit about traffic management and things like that. So I think there is a kind of mutual interest in learning from one another.
I would just add, you know, it's one of the great things about being at UCLA is that, you know, there's a lot of things that get shared with other universities and other cities around the world. And so, you know, for example, you know, air quality success stories here in Los Angeles have been, you know, traded with India and traded with China, and there's always exchange of scholars in different places. That really makes a big difference. I've had the fortune to have a number of regulatory discussions, what a shock, on water, with a number of folks around the world. And you know, there's a lot of copying of our Clean Water Act. There's a lot of copying of some of our other environmental laws. They often don't have the monitoring or the enforcement structure to go with that, and are grossly understaffed to really make sure that the regulations are actually complied with, and that's a huge issue. But from the standpoint of basically learning from the U.S. experience and how we've dealt with regulatory issues, you know, and what better example, obviously, than climate mitigation? We're really leading the world on that right now, on innovation. So
I've been in these conversations with mayors, Mayor Garcetti and Mayor of London and Mayor Paris and others, and mayors from the Global South, and it's happened more than once where they sit around and talk about who could do the best, like who gets the award for stealing the best idea from another city. And it's true, like we want them to steal the great ideas from each other that are really solving things.
All right, I think right now we're pretty much at time. And so one last question. Anybody? I can't see you. Maybe the mics are gone at this point. Maybe that's their way of saying it's 9 o'clock. Okay. Okay, I'm not seeing anybody. Oh, okay. All right, last question. You get the last word.
I was wondering, when you're considering these questions of sustainability, do you give the explosive growth of the human population, do you take that as a given?
Wow. Yeah, it's a question.
Well, I guess my follow-up to that is that we're adding 1 billion people every 12 to 14 years, and wouldn't that tend to overwhelm all these changes that you're trying to make at the margins?
Ouch. I don't like that last at the margins crack, but
is this the way we're going to end tonight? Yeah.
Yeah. God, I could have stopped at 9. Damn. The answer is not going to be one you like, which is from the standpoint of looking at the sustainable city megacity issue within Los Angeles and looking at these. You guys can vouch for the other cities, but looking at Los Angeles, yeah, we're building in the population growth projection from the State Department of Finance of moving from 10 million to 11.5 million by 2050. And so it's not like we're blind to it, and it's not like we're not taking it into account and figuring out what needs to be done from a sustainability perspective. But from saying that that's individual megacity is solving the globe's problems, that's naive, and we're not pretending that that's what we're doing in the focus on the Sustainable LA Grand Challenge. Now, that being said, I think the approach, whether or not we get there or not, on the Paris Accord, was really taking that into account in a huge way. And so, but what you're not seeing, what I think you're implying is getting at, is saying what everyone should do globally on population policy, and that's pretty much still as much of a third rail issue today as it was back in the 70s on how do you do that. It's pretty much left for every nation to decide what they want to do in their sovereignty to deal with these issues, but that the metrics and the targets are, you got to get to these carbon emissions reductions. I don't know if you guys want to add to that.
No, I mean, you take that and you just say, hey, if we improve the human condition by using less resources as we get more efficient and able to produce, as more people get onto the grid or use electricity, how do we do it in a more efficient, cheaper way? And the idea is, per capita we're using less and less, and hopefully then people are procreating less, fewer children, and so but it's not addressing the core challenge. I mean, it's as Mark said, it's largely been seen as a third rail issue still.
The only thing I would add to that is that it's really unevenly distributed, right? So when we talk about global population growth, it's opposite in Japan as in Africa. Mm-hmm. So, when we think of like the overall metrics, I think we're burying some very important variation that would be helpful to bring into play as we're trying to think through how to address this on a global scale. And on top of that, then the migration that's occurring now, which is unprecedented, and then the closing down of borders complicates the redistribution of that population in ways that start to make sustainable sense, whether it's for economic reasons or social reasons or cultural reasons. So, altogether, I think you've hit on the closing issue for the evening. Uh-huh.
But I mean, just to also put that in perspective, the global expansion of the middle class and increased consumption, because middle class is growing at an unprecedented rate around the world, and making sure that that growth is occurring in a manner that's not going to lead to greater resource consumption is really, it's completely intertwined with the climate question.
Did you want us to just make it worse as a result of your starting
food
question?
security, increased meat consumption, on and on.
And on that note, thank you guys so much for coming here tonight. Let's give a round of applause for our panelists.
Everyone come out.
All right, have a good night.